Welcome to our event this evening. I am Assistant Professor Jean Jaminet. Thank you for coming to our College of Architecture and Environmental Design lecture series. It is my job to introduce the lecture this evening, so I'm just going to begin by saying, if Mario Carpo has suggested search is the new science, then big data is the new history. However, this is not a history that is recognizable to many of us. It's not a master narrative in the tradition of Siegfried Gideon, nor a unified nonlinear history in the tradition of Colin Rowe. Each search of the abundant and raw data that is now available to everyone will result in a multiverse of narratives, which implies an infinite number of possible histories that may result from each and every individual search, tending toward the idiosyncratic, speculative, and ephemeral. I'm happy to introduce our guest lecturer, Galo Cañizares, whose research embodies this thinking. Galo's ongoing research concerns the production of architectural media after the rise of digital culture. Additionally, his research and design collaborative, Office CA, investigates alternative methods for architectural practice, exploring recurring themes including absurdity, simulation, storytelling, and the parafictional. Galo holds a Master of Architecture from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a Bachelor of Environmental Design from the College of Architecture and Planning at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He has lectured widely, and his writings have been published in academic journals and magazines, including Clog, Platt Journal, and Log. Galo has worked as a designer in the offices of Nada, Kennedy and Violich, and Kiyu Sung-woo. He has previously taught at Syracuse University and was named Howard E. Lefevre Emerging Practitioner Fellow at the Ohio State University Knowlton School of Architecture in 2016, where he is continuing to conduct his teaching and research today. Galo's lecture this evening is entitled On Field Guides and Martian Landscapes and coincides with the opening of his exhibition, The Field Guide to Martian Landscapes, which is on display just around the corner in the Armstrong Gallery. The Field Guide is one possible open-ended narrative interpreted from the largest public database of high-fidelity Martian surface information, told from a singular perspective no more correct or incorrect, desirable or objectionable than any other history. The power of this kind of storytelling does not reside in the translation of this data into simulated alien terrains, but rather in the incompatibility and misinterpretation that is implicit in the act of collecting, recording, transmitting, and searching this immense archive of historical data. By doing so, provokes the proliferation of other possible histories, conception myths, legends of place, and science fictions and fantasies associated with extraterrestrial colonization. The historiographer and the architect are connected in their ancestral impulse to tell stories or build narratives. In these terms, the Field Guide to Martian Landscapes is a digital tapestry intentionally woven with knots, holes, and glitches, implicit in the sheer magnitude and incompatibility of information used in its invention. The granularity of this investigation is evident in Galo's approach, his critical approach to navigating information management systems and its implications for the practice of architecture, which suggests an equally diverse territory of speculation regarding the production of architectural media and alternate forms of architectural expression. Please join us following the lecture for a reception outside the Armstrong Gallery in honor of the opening of the exhibition. But now please join me in welcoming Galo Cañizares as he speculates on the future habitation of the red planet.
Thank you, Gene. That was very insightful, and I think it's a little bit better than what I'm going to present today. So we'll have a lot to talk about at dinner. I want to thank Gene and mostly his students for helping out with the setup of the gallery outside. I want to thank John Yoder and Dean Mister for inviting me and being extremely supportive of this kind of bizarre project that has that started about a year ago and is, kind of an ongoing experiment in the, in the quest to find meaning out of infinite buckets of data, essentially. Okay. So I like to tell people that I'm a conspiracy theorist. For one, it sounds better than just theorist, but it also allows me to operate in a couple of different ways. It allows me to mix fact and fiction. It allows me to focus on alternative realities. But probably most importantly, it allows me to work through narrative and to use narrative techniques. In a way, the best part about being and labeling yourself a conspiracy theorist is that your theories are never 100% verifiable, but they're always highly scrutinized. Conspiracies always involve a high degree of research and precision, and of course, at times, paranoia. But that's not to say that I sleep with a tinfoil hat or anything. What I mean is that I firmly believe that architecture operates between the fictional and the factual, between the speculative and the plausible, which is essentially exactly where conspiracy theorists operate. And so for a while now, this has been my primary methodology. What this also allows for is for architecture to tackle issues outside of its immediate history and to work kind of allegorically. So for example, if one were to study the history of space and space colonization, and particularly this kind of image, the immediate impulse might be to think about utopia or dystopia or some kind of a technological positivism, right? So the idea that technology would save mankind in some way. But if you approach it in a more sort of conspiratorial way, we can bypass a lot of these concepts which might be considered naive and scrutinize in all seriousness the politics behind an image such as this. Here we could begin to speculate on the goals of this project, which was a project conducted by NASA in 1975. And we could speculate on who funded the research for this, who funded this project, and why it was actually important to study space habitation in 1975. Hint, Cold War. And so that's to say that acting like a conspiracy theorist, architects, or me in particularly, can engage history, politics, design, and culture more specifically in our projects. And so the project that I'll be presenting and the project that's on show at the Armstrong Gallery is fundamentally about Mars, but it has a lot of other layers to it as well. And it shouldn't be understood as a kind of techno-positivist analysis of another world, and here's where Gene was, right on point. Because it's really a kind of allegory of translation, an allegory of big data, and a story about the cultural issues and speculative narratives that arise when we try to synthesize knowledge from other worlds, especially as we continue to live with the problematic ghosts of colonization and certain colonial attitudes. And so this is the first drawing of Mars, officially. I'm sure there's been a lot of stories told about Mars over the centuries, but this was the first, this is considered the first official drawing of Mars. And it was drawn by the astronomer Francesco Fontana in 1636. And what I think is kind of interesting here is that this is how we learned about other worlds back then, right? We looked at things through lenses and we drew what we saw. And the funny thing about this is that this drawing was obviously later refuted, but it was because it turned out that that dark mark that you see over there was actually a smudge in the telescope. And the way that they found this out was that there was obviously no way for there to be such stark contrast with the lenses that, that telescopes had back then. And so the whole history of astronomy is fraught with funny little errors like this, and most of them depend on drawing and accuracy of drawing. But before we can get to Mars, I first want to talk about clouds. And mostly because they're oddly relevant in any discussion about drawing things that are essentially hard to draw and hard to classify. In the late 18th century / early 19th century, there was a strong attitude towards classifying the natural world. We called this movement naturalism. And the general idea, if you remember your elementary school classes, was that after the Enlightenment and after explorers had sailed around the world and encountered all different natural phenomena, they concluded that parts of the world could be cataloged and systematized. Right? So plants, animals, rocks started to be studied and put into separate categories. Darwin was assembling his theories of evolution, and Carl Linnaeus standardized the naming of all natural things. So Linnaeus is where you get the tradition of naming things with Latin roots. And along with this desire to classify everything, this was also where the first textbooks were starting to appear. Again, all these textbooks were speculative, and they depended on drawings, and they depended on hypotheses and theories. And this is when you have debates between Darwin and Lamarck on evolution. There were essentially a lot of debates, right? Because everybody was very curious, and everybody thought that they had the best theories. And so here, you have Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who was famous for providing the opposing theory to Darwin's theory of natural selection, which was exemplified by the kind of giraffe example that species evolved generationally, and that, for example, the giraffe passed down traits to have a longer neck from father to offspring. And along with this, oh, sorry. Okay, and so Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he decided that it was, it's all fine and dandy to classify the stuff that we see, but what about the stuff that we sort of see and stuff that's a little bit more immaterial, like clouds? Well, what he decided to do was partner with an English chemist and create a taxonomy of clouds. Right? He wanted to standardize these immaterial things. And they set off on a mission to draw as many clouds as they could and create a taxonomy of their ideal conditions. Right? They were analyzed in the field and given the names that we know today, like cirrus, stratus, cumulus, nimbus, etc. Now, while the desire may have been to produce a kind of encyclopedia of clouds, to me, this actually seems like one of the earliest types of field guides. Right? The field guide was not really a thing until field work started to be a thing, right? So all of these cloud studies were done in the field. They were done looking up and sketching. They analyzed patterns and shapes and collated their sketches to examine continuities and emerging trends. And so this idea of being outside, examining figures in the sky, and producing a book that provides references for anybody that wants to venture outside and learn about clouds was kind of a revolutionary idea. And I don't think this was exactly the goal, but it definitely paved the way for the whole field guide typology. Now, of course, what comes to mind when we talk about field guide is probably something like this, right? Just you see images of creatures with short little descriptions. But I think it's important to know that it comes out of this comes out of the naturalism movement, and is actually part of a larger cultural shift. And I think it's also important to understand the links between naturalism and colonialism, because there is a specific attitude in all of these publications at the time that the Western world had some kind of a claim to other world objects. Now, we can't ignore the fact that Europeans were traveling to various continents under the guise of superiority and extracting a wide variety of goods from those places. You know, all of this was done with under a colonial agenda, which always marginalized or even exoticized the others. And whether it was indigenous tribes or precious resources or even exotic animals, right? So this is a kind of best example of the colonial agenda. You know, here they thought that the best way to study an exotic creature was to kill it and stuff it and hang it in your living room. Now, of course, we now realize that this is the wrong approach, but back then, the study of exotic goods and things was very much linked to collecting treasures and objectifying foreign stuff. Now, I mention this when it comes to field guides and field studies because, as we know it today, field work is aware of itself, right? There's a notion that working in the field inevitably changes the conditions of the field itself. And so if you are tasked with creating a field guide or writing a field guide, the author is supposed to both respect the field at the same time acknowledging our own impact on the field and its surroundings. Now, nevertheless, the field guide as a type of publication is an incredibly powerful tool. Some of the best examples of successful field guides come from ornithology. Here we see the core elements of the field guide, right? So this is from the Manual of the Ornithology of the United States and Canada. The species name is written in Latin and in English, according to the Linnaean tradition. There's a brief description of each bird and an illustration. And the drawings here are probably the most relevant and interesting part of the field guide. Because the goal of the illustrator is not necessarily to represent a realistic version of the bird, but instead a simplified abstraction, it can be easily recognized. They become a little diagrammatic and elemental, right? Because the goal of the field guide is essentially to be able to identify quickly the difference between a red-backed sandpiper and a western sandpiper in the field. And so the drawings tend to only depict the key features of the birds, but also they provide consistency throughout the guide in terms of forms, textures, line weights, et cetera, et cetera. And so as designers, I think we can really appreciate that. But that's enough about field guides. Let's talk about Mars. So around this time, right, so after the sort of heyday of naturalism, there was numerous advancements in lens and telescope technologies. The idea of exploration and looking systemically at the natural world was inevitably extended upwards towards space. So they started with clouds and then they moved further and further out. Of course, astronomy was nothing new, and there was a number of astronomers looking at Mars at the time. I'm only going to focus on these two figures, Giovanni Schiaparelli and Percival Lowell. Schiaparelli was an Italian astronomer who was one of the earliest people to draw a complete map of Mars. Percival Lowell was founder of the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, famous for a lot of images of Mars, but also for discovering Pluto. These two have a really bizarre story that weirdly enough had a huge effect on how we perceive Mars, both scientifically, but also as part of our kind of cultural imaginary. In 1877, Schiaparelli accidentally found Mars. He was looking up at the sky, and it happened that in 1877, Mars was in a perfect alignment with Earth, so that it was completely on the opposite side of the sun. Now, this means that Mars was very clear and very well lit. And so, as soon as Schiaparelli noticed it, he decided to draw what he saw. And this is essentially how astronomy worked back then, right? It was a very imprecise science. But he kept drawing what he saw, and in the end, what he realized was that Mars had a sort of strange geometric shadows that looked like straight lines. And what he did was he started to piece together a map of Mars, one of the earliest maps of Mars. And naturally, he used the Mercator projection, which is the sort of the spherical projection that we use to, or that was used to draw maps of the Earth, right? So the map with North and South America on the left and Europe, Asia on the right is the Mercator projection. And so he decided to make the same map of Mars with similar longitudes and latitudes. And his first attempt was this weird figure ground plan that showed little islands, and he supposed that the shadows may have been water, just like they were on Earth. Immediately he decided that they weren't water, but that they were some kind of a series of channels, and that it may have been water at some point in time. His next set of maps was a lot more detailed. And this one includes the little geometric channels that he kept seeing, right? So not only do you have the bigger figures, but you have the smaller, straight geometric lines. And now pay attention to that because that's going to be very important. There's no obvious problem with this map, right? It's a kind of speculative drawing, and that was fine and dandy at the time. But there's a problem with how this map was described. The channels that he included here in the Italian were written as canali, but as they are translated into English, canali can be loosely translated to canal, which is not a geographic feature, but an infrastructural feature. And so with the publication of this map and the mistranslation, there was a suggestion that the channels were actually artificial. And so immediately after the map was released, the scientific community was thrown a curveball because some interpreted the map as being evidence of intelligent life on Mars.
Let's go through that gateway. There, right there. God does not build in straight lines.
So that was essentially the logic, right? God does not build in straight lines. Because the lines were geometric and that they had some kind of a form to them, there must have been an intelligent civilization on Mars to build them. Now the theory was then adopted by Percival Lowell, who continued to study the geometric channels over and over again and publishing his findings in scientific journals, but also in popular magazines. Of course, this was a subject of great debate in the astronomical community, and some thought that this was a kind of ridiculous theory, but there were others that were completely behind it, right? Because there was really no way to disprove it. Now, unfortunately, as Schiaparelli grew older, he began losing his sight, and he eventually stopped working altogether. However, by this time, Lowell had already made a series of maps of Mars. He had named a lot more canals and was lecturing widely on a theory of Martian life. He began to speculate that the canals had been most likely constructed as an effort to bring water down from the ice caps. He envisioned a kind of intelligent Martian community that saw the planet becoming more and more arid and that needed to bring water from the polar ice caps into the center of the planet. And again, this theory, for some reason, it comes out of nowhere, but it actually is completely based on the geometry that he saw. And because it was published in magazines, it continued to cause scandals in the scientific community. Now, the opposing camp was determined to disprove Lowell's theories, but it wouldn't be until 1909 that some of his followers would turn against him and essentially disproved him completely. They used new photographic techniques to refute the claims, and it was actually the Greek astronomer Eugene Antoniadi that eventually disproved Lowell by using the brand new telescope at the Paris Observatory. He wrote a number of letters to Lowell himself and said, "We thus see in the so-called canals a work of nature, not of intellect, the spots reliving the gloom of a wilderness and not the titanic productions of supernatural beings. To account for their various phenomena, we need only invoke the natural agencies of vegetation, water, cloud, and inevitable differences of color in a desert region." It also helped that Antoniadi was a highly accomplished artist and draftsman. Yet by this time, Lowell had already written a number of books on the topic of Mars and had already published his theory about Martian life in a couple of different books. He had students that remained faithful to him. One of them was Edward Morse, who wrote a book called Mars and Its Mystery, and who would continue to campaign for Lowell's theories for the next couple of years. Mars and Its Mystery is a particularly interesting book because it continues this idea of how geometry is evidence of intelligent life. Morse compares the street grids and railroad infrastructures on Earth to the drawings of the Martian canals, calling them all examples of artificial lines. And so in a way, what might be a kind of emergent thesis out of all of this is that geometry and drawing can have a profound impact on the cultural imaginary as a whole. Because obviously, after Lowell's theories were published, Mars and the image of Mars became a cultural phenomenon in itself. For example, War of the Worlds was written in 1897, and around the same time, it was written around the same time in 1897, and it featured hostile visitors from another planet, most likely Mars. Russian writer Alexander Bogdanov wrote a novel called Red Star in 1908, which was a novel about a futuristic communist society on Mars. He posited that while communism may have its flaws on Earth, Mars might actually be the perfect testing ground for a communist society. And of course, there's another dimension to the kind of cultural imaginary of space exploration, which is the heroic figure, which could be related to a kind of colonial attitude. But I just like how they always zoom in on the astronaut's face. Now today, we obviously have an incredible set of new technologies for observing other worlds and gathering data. However, instead of telescopes, or in addition to telescopes, I should say, we now send vehicles and satellites to gather images that stitch them together to get three-dimensional information. The process is called photogrammetry, and it's, if we're talking about Latin roots, it quite literally means light writing. And it's the process of combining two images of the same thing from different angles to extract a three-dimensional data. It could be two images, or it could be a series of images, actually, because photogrammetry is also how we 3D scan objects and how our phones stitch together spherical panoramas. But in space, it usually consists of a few satellites gathering thousands of pictures and seaming them together. In 1964, NASA launched Mariner 4, which was a probe, and it was the first probe to photograph the planet up close. And since then, we've gathered a huge amount of data on Mars. Now, this has enabled us to map the red planet incredibly accurately. And you'll notice that Schiaparelli's naming convention is still used. And there's actually a region and a crater named after Schiaparelli. It's featured in my field guide. But if we look at Mars today, we obviously know that there are no canals, right? We know that there are riverbeds, and that there used to be water on the planet, and that there are extinct volcanoes, plains, dunes, craters, but no artificial structures, so no Martians. The only artificial structures that we find are the ones that NASA left behind. And there's a kind of ever-increasing resolution of the planet. NASA and JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, are working with universities like the University of Arizona to collect as much information on the surface of Mars as possible. If we're talking about the kind of cultural shift of naturalism, today might be the cultural shift of data gathering or searching. And the project that collects all of this data is called the High Resolution Imaging Science Experiment. And this is really where my field guide to Martian landscapes began. I was looking at digital terrain modeling technology and GIS, and I found out that NASA had this ongoing project to map Mars at a resolution of 1 meter equals 1 pixel. This is the resolution that Google Maps was at in around, let's say, 2010. And I was fascinated by the sheer abundance of data they had. Since NASA is a public institution, they have to release their research into the public. But it's not very easy to digest this information. NASA has custom PDS files, which stand for Planetary Data System. And they can only be read with a very selective suite of software. Luckily, a lot of this software is free. And the one I chose to study is called Microdem, and it was actually designed by a professor at the US Naval Academy. Of course, the goal of this program is to extract GIS data from aerial images from Earth, but with a few tweaks, you can get it to read these planetary data files from Mars. And we can turn them into what's called black and white height maps. I'm not going to go too deep into the technology, but this idea of translating between imaging software is something that I've been interested in for a while, and I am actually working with my students on a couple of exercises where we translate images from different software and then back and forth to see what happens to the image. Essentially, what these black and white height maps allow you to do is to use 3D displacement mapping tools in software like 3D Studio Max or Maya or Blender and recreate the topography in mesh form. It basically takes the black and white values and extrudes vertices according to their brightness values. So essentially, white equals the highest point and black equals the lowest point. Now, what I also realized when looking at these data sets is that I needed more powerful software to deal with higher density meshes. I didn't have NASA's resources. And so if I wanted to create more detailed topographies, I had to reach out to a different industry, namely video game design and visual effects design. And here, these industries use a program called World Machine to create the backdrops for video games and for movies. So most likely what you saw in the video clip from Prometheus was generated with World Machine. Now, here, I could now export million polygon meshes that were incredibly high resolution and made good use of the 1 pixel to 1 meter resolution of the image. And so the field guide to Martian landscapes is not really about the images themselves, but it's actually more about the ways in which we use data and the way that NASA uses data, and how the virtual world actually helps us learn more about our own world, or at the very least, how it helps us form other images of our world. The guide itself consists of 80 drawings, each specifically an architectural type of representation, plans, axonometrics, renderings, etc. And like I said, translating between software was a big component of the project from the start. I went from 1 gigabyte IMG files to height maps to 1 million polygon meshes to 1,000 polygon meshes to 200 polygon meshes and back and forth in order to achieve the best workflow between objects. The models moved from World Machine to 3D Studio Max to Rhino. They were rendered as textures. They were rendered as axonometrics. They were rendered as virtual reality panoramas. And what you see in the gallery is a wide variety of media that explains the different ways in which we can experience the data and the images from Mars. And so what you see here are the initial processed images from microdem, right? So I have not altered any of these. These are 1 gigabyte data sets that are .img files that you can download from the HiRise database. And as soon as you set up microdem to be able to read these files, it generates that color, right? The colors come from the software itself that uses the color spectrum to designate elevation data. And so every image is actually different, has a different color spectrum scale. So even though some of the colors are consistent, sometimes green means a different elevation. So sometimes it'll be a difference of 500 meters, and sometimes it might be a difference of only about 50 meters. But usually it's actually pretty drastic. There are 16 landscapes in total. As of right now, NASA has around 468 data sets available, and it grows every month, right? So if you go to that website today, there will probably be 470. The actual locations that I picked for the field guide are less important than the geographical features. What I tried to do was to capture a wide range of landscape phenomena, like types and scales of craters, riverbeds, dunes, canyons, and any other feature that would sort of embody the experience of being on Mars. Of course, Mars is an entire desert, so there's really not that much variety. But you'd be surprised. The models themselves were CNC milled out of EPS foam and treated with stucco and paint, much like you would an architectural model. The mill file had to be lower resolution in order for the machine to be able to process it, right? Because you can't just feed 1 million polygon mesh into a CNC router. And so while these renders are actually 1,000 polygon meshes, the foam models are only about half that resolution. Again, the idea of how to represent these landscapes was really interesting to me, and having been interested in the depictions from the naturalism movement, I thought it would be interesting to go back to these 19th century studies of clouds that were almost picturesque or romantic, and represent Mars in that way for the field guide. So these renders are actually the geometry of the landscape mapped with the height maps, the height map spectrum map. And so the result is this kind of psychedelic or hallucinatory portrait of Mars. And I think they're kind of funny. And the funny thing is that you actually have to render this twice, right? So you have to make the the portrait render, and then you have to set up the frame and the room and as another 3D model, and then render the previous render as a texture. So it's a kind of render of a render, which is absurd and silly, and nobody should ever do it. Now, I've also been getting really into VR lately, and mostly the geometric distortions that are associated with preparing images for VR. In a way, this actually comes back to Lowell and Schiaparelli because they were dealing with spherical projections as well, right? And they were taking into account the spherical distortions of the planet and distorting their geometric lines to create unrolled surfaces, right? But of course, these are all made with for a virtual camera and a ray tracing renderer. And these are just some images from Mars. Just kidding, these are the renders. So with that, let's go see some Martian landscapes. And I'll answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That was wonderful. So we're going to take some questions, but since I have the microphone, I'm going to start. I love the way that you put together the 19th century field guides with the 21st century pixels and gradients from the GIS software. And I'm just wondering if you make any connections maybe in your teaching, connecting those drawing techniques with kind of the ability for the computer to digitally generate these other kind of images. Any thoughts or future plans?
Yeah, I mean, I think this feeds directly into my teaching. I've been running a studio at Knowlton called Translations from Image to Building. And of course, it's a play off Robin Evans, but it's also about how the emphasis on images that is sort of the paradigm of today, right? So the exposure to millions of images can affect the way that we design, or is in fact affecting the way that we design. And so in this studio, we take images and we only operate with images. So we don't do that many drawings, we only manipulate images. And so translating an image from one piece of software to another piece of software, going from pixel to vector and back to pixel, and then going from vector or pixel to 3D model is also a kind of interesting workflow. And so I think while this is a very kind of carefully curated set of distortions and translations, in my teaching I get a little bit more experimental with it and see if you can actually make a building out of an image in some way, or make space out of an image, sort of by appropriating these pieces of software.
Okay, and do we have any other questions from the audience?
So I'm really interested in this idea of taking the real, or what is perceived to be the real, and then projecting it into some form of representation, and then projecting it back into reality. So and kind of discovering the problems and the glitches that occur when you do that, which I think you're kind of getting at a lot with experimenting with VR. So I was wondering if you could just expand on what you were doing with VR a little bit more.
Well, like I said, I'm really interested in geometry, and so the way that I got into VR is mostly through analyzing spherical projections and the shift of, let's say the shift from the flat picture plane, which is very much a kind of 20th century, well, from the Renaissance all the way to the late 20th century mode of working for architects, into a sort of spherical picture plane, right? So if you look at the algorithms and the distortions that are involved with making images for VR, it's a very intricate geometric distortion, right? And I think as architects, that's what we do. We distort geometries and we move around things. And so I don't think that this is scrutinized enough. And so what I'm looking at is how this shift from a kind of flat to panoramic to fully spherical environment might actually affect how we design and how we communicate designs or communicate space, right? So for example, VR is it's a really bizarre way of representing something because it's very individual. So it's based on the kind of personal bubble. You put on a headset and you're in your own little world and you don't really interact with anybody else. You only interact with data or representations of data, I guess. And so, I don't know, I'm interested in how geometry, like what the role of geometry is in the perception of space, I guess. It's actually like not, it's a pretty classical way of looking at things.
I saw some other hands.
I really appreciated your talk, and I like how you began with the point about narrative. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the fact that a map is always a lie, trying to sort of depict some kind of truth, that the map maker actually thinks that they're being accurate when they're actually distorting views. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how narrative comes into play, because obviously your drawings and your models are there are decisions that you're making, there are choices, So within that space between lie and truth, there's choice about what you are doing. Were other narratives in your mind, like maybe Edgar Rice Burroughs or Kim Stanley Robinson, or some of these other ideas of ways that we've sort of depicted Mars? So did they influence any of the decisions between your maps and the data that you had,
Yeah, definitely. Actually, around this time, the time I was making this project, I had read 2312 by Kim Stanley Robinson. But I think the idea of narrative is just pervasive in everything that I do. I think that there's really no architecture without narrative. We always think in a narrative way. And so when I was crafting these drawings and when I was researching just maps in general and map distortions and geometric distortions, there's always a kind of weird tension between authorship and narrative, I guess, because these 18th century and 17th century maps that were drawn with the Mercator projection were very much kind of political drawings, right? So they're drawings that put Europe in the center and then everything else was around it in a very kind of FU type of way. And so the idea of distorting maps and drawing and just putting lines down on paper is very much a kind of authoritative act. And if you're the author, then you can sort of control the narrative. And with this project, I sort of, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's based off of like science fiction narratives and kind of debunking a lot of the myths of science fiction, such as the idea that technology will save mankind or something like that, or that or like in the novel Red Star, where Mars is a kind of tabula rasa for testing out whether communism works or something like that. Here, it's literally just presented as a series of experimental drawings that have, that try not to be, I don't know, they try not to have any kind of baggage, but obviously they probably do, and I hope that that baggage is actually more aesthetic than political or colonial, right? I'm not suggesting that we use these maps for any sort of colonization, even though I sort of mention it. That's just my way of bringing up the issues that have been associated with drawing maps, and actually with pushing towards new frontiers, or quote, frontiers.
Anyone else?
Thanks for a really great lecture. I think the questions are very provocative, and you can kind of tell it was a great lecture because of the provocations that are taking the form of questions. I'm glad you invoked Robin Evans. I was thinking about Evans and his concept of viscosity through the entire lecture. And I'm wondering, he used this term viscosity to describe the logics of a representational system that bleed through into the final designed artifact. And we're about to go see some really great images and artifacts here in the gallery. I'm just wondering, which viscosities did you stumble upon in the milling or finishing or printing process that you were most excited by? What are the really great viscosities that you maybe didn't expect that you discovered in this exploration?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, the project is still kind of fresh, right? So it's hard for me to reflect too much on it, and I'm still kind of working on it. But something that came up that was very intriguing when analyzing these images, and actually you can see a lot of it in the raw images that are presented in the gallery, are the traces of the technology used for not me creating this, but for like NASA creating this. There are a lot of images which look like they're grainy or look like they do have some kind of a geometric feature to it. Some look like they have almost like film grain or roadways or something like that, which actually takes us back to the misinterpretations of Schiaparelli. But those were actually the seams in the photogrammetry process, right? So because NASA is relying on very advanced technology, but even this advanced technology is not perfect, some of that gets translated into the material that I used, right? So you see some of these craters that are being milled that have some stitched lines, which isn't my doing. It's actually just comes straight from that satellite and how the satellite processed that data. So in a way, it's not just a process of translation from like image to drawing to model, but it's about mistranslation from drawing to image to model, right? And again, I think my bigger sort of thesis is that misappropriation or appropriating mistakes can be very productive. And so I don't know if that's viscous enough, but it's interesting.
Okay, let's take one more question.
How does your previous work with blank space and comics affect the process that you just went through? And if you plan to go back to comics and blank space, like how will that be different?
I think when I was doing my master's thesis, my advisor really wanted me to make a comic book, and I'd never really been that into comic books, but I thought that it would be interesting to try out the medium because it was a highly kind of narrative project. And so I would say that I've always been interested in narrative in various different forms, right? And so the comics that I did earlier, a couple years ago, are more like media experiments, right? So I sort of dipped my toe in that medium, and then I moved on. And I'm not saying that this is all I'm going to do, but I think that emerging forms of narrative are really interesting to me. You know, there are a lot of writers and academics in the digital humanities that are exploring how digital technology is affecting narrative, right? So with phenomena like fake news and all this stuff, those are all narrative techniques, right? And so I'm more interested in these kind of subversive or subtle ways of telling stories rather than explicitly, let's say, writing out a short story or drawing comic books. That's just not what I'm interested in right now. Should we go to the gallery?
I think we should.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Again, please join us for refreshments and to peruse the gallery and exhibition just outside the lecture hall. Thank you again for coming. Our next lecture, John, can you remind me the next lecture, Sylvia Lavin? Okay. Okay, stay tuned. Thank you again.